O CMCite, Huxquile Tanoyap, Carolyn Roberts Quinnsna, Tanach Cha Tela Skoomish Okameach, Tanach Cha Tela Nukwakwa Okameach. It is a huge honor for me to be a visitor today on the ancestral territories of the Kwantlen, the Katzie, and the Matsqui First Nations. For thousands and thousands of years, our ancestors sought to walk gently upon this land, to nurture it and to take care of it in order for us to be here today. And for that, Hayachka, I'm so thankful. It was our ancestors that taught the settlers how to hunt and how to fish and how to survive upon this land. And today, we are seeking a new relationship with the First Nations people of this territory, one that's built on honor and deep respect. And in order for that to happen, it is time for us to educate ourselves about the history of this land that we call Turtle Island. And today I would like to share some of that history with you today, some culture, and some ways to move forward in reconciliation. It is also a privilege for me to be able to speak my ancestral language to you of the Squamish people. It is a dying language. We only have 4 fluent speakers that are still alive today. It's our language that connects us to our community, to our people, and to our history. And what I said was, hello and welcome, honored guests. My name is Carolyn Roberts, and I'm from the Squamish Nation up in North Vancouver. My birth name is Stacy Baker, so anybody who knows North Vancouver knows that because I'm a baker that I'm pretty much related to everybody in North Vancouver. My birth mother is Janet Baker, and she comes from the Nukwakwa Nation, so our ancestors are just up past Whistler. When I was born the 4th child of an Indigenous, single, divorced Indigenous woman. And her caseworker at the time was under the mandate to adopt me out into a non-Indigenous home. This is part of our Canadian history that is called the 60s Scoop. Now, it lasted from 1960 all the way up until the 1980s. And it was a governmental practice of adopting out Indigenous children into non-Indigenous homes in order to assimilate them into the colonial system. Now, I was one of the luckier few of this process because I only spent 3 months in the foster care system, but there's some Indigenous kids that spent their entire life in the foster care system. I grew up in Prince George. I grew up in white suburbia. There was 1 black kid at our school, and there was a handful of East Indian students at our school, and all the Aboriginal students were in the alternate ed program. So in my upbringing, I had no history and no culture. None of that was taught to me, and I had no idea what it meant to be a Coast Salish woman. It was stripped of me when I was adopted out. This is not unlike the residential school system did to all of my other relatives that went to residential school. This is 2 out of my 3 sisters. They all went to the Seashelt residential school. Not only were they stripped of their culture, their language, and their history, and their connections to the land, they were also taught at residential school that they didn't belong, because they weren't allowed to be in the regular school system with everybody else. But at the residential school, they, like myself, are fair-skinned Coast Salish women, and they got beat up every single day because they weren't brown enough to be at the Indian school. So this is my birth mother, Janet Baker. Her and all of her siblings went to St. Mary's out in Mission. Their mother, my grandmother, spoke 5 Indigenous languages from all of the territories where we're from. My birth mother speaks none, nor does she attend any cultural events, because at school she was taught that it was wrong to speak her language, and it was wrong to practice her culture. Not only did the school teach her that, it also shut her down to other people in her life, and she has never hugged anybody. Now, their mother, all of her children were taken from her and taken to Mission Residential School. This is about a 6 or 7 hour drive away from where they lived, and it eventually became too much for her to be far away from her children, and she eventually moved closer to be with them. And as a mother, I can't even begin to imagine how this felt. I'm pretty lucky. I find myself lucky because these are my children. These are the first children in our line of family that have not been taken by the government and placed into a non-Indigenous home. When you talk about the residential school system being something of our past and our history, and it's time to move on, it's not that far in our history. And it's not far gone. I'm one of the lucky ones that don't get my children taken away. But if you look at statistics in Canada today, you will find the government is still taking Indigenous children from their homes and placing them into non-Indigenous homes. Today, we call it the foster care system. And there is more Indigenous children today in our foster care system than ever went to residential school today. So if we look at the population of Indigenous people across Canada, we're about 4% of this population. If we look at the foster care system, 60% of children in the foster care system are Indigenous. And most of them are intergenerational survivors of residential school. So when you say, it's time to move on and it's time to get over it, I say, how is that possible? How can we move on and get over it when it is still happening today here in Canada? And not only that, if we look at some more statistics, 50% of families that live on reservations today live in poverty. And 60 reservations across Canada today live in a boil water advisory. And some of them have been living in that advisory now for over 20 years. How is that possible in a place that we call so great as Canada? How would that be okay, that you cannot provide clean drinking water for your family? Especially in a place like Canada that is such a wonderful place to be. We actually rank in the top 10 standards of living in the world to be living here in Canada. But that is if you are a non-Indigenous person. If you are an Indigenous person, you rank about number 47th on that list. How is that possible? We live in the same place. So you might be asking yourself, well, why should that matter? That doesn't affect me. And I don't understand why we still have to have this conversation. We need to have this conversation, and we need to educate ourselves because of the Canada, the place that you live, this land that you live upon, and the resources that come from this land have all been violently taken from the original custodians of this land. And the exceptional lifestyle that you live today, living in Canada, has been built upon the cultural genocide of an entire population. And you might not have started this fight, but this fight still continues today with the government, and the governmental practices that are in place today continue it. So then that makes it your responsibility as a Canadian citizen to make it right. Now, I understand that this isn't something that's going to happen overnight and change right away, but we need to start changing it, and through time it will. but 150 years is way too long to wait for justice to be done. In my culture, we like to teach through story. And I'd like to share a story with you today of our wonderful friend, the Coyote. He teaches us a lot. I'm a storyteller, and I tell stories to make my ancestors proud and to quietly teach. So our friend, the Coyote, was frantically looking one day, searching and searching around the fire because he couldn't find his bone needle. So out of the sky follows this owl, and he sees that Coyote is very distressed, and he says, "Coyote, my friend, what is going on? What are you looking for?" And Coyote says, "Well, I can't find my bone needle anywhere." And the owl said, "Well, I'll go up into the sky. I'll be able to see it from the sky, and I'll bring it back to you." So off he goes, and he flies around and around, but he can't see that bone needle anywhere. So he comes back down, and he says, "Coyote, my friend, I couldn't find your bone needle. I couldn't see it from way up there." And Coyote was so distressed. And so Owl says, "Well, Coyote, where was the last time you had your bone needle?" Coyote said, "Well, I was using it over here by the bushes." And Owl looks perplexed at Coyote, and he says, "Well, if you were using it over there by the bushes, how come you're looking over here by the fire for your bone needle?" And Coyote says, "Well, because I can see over here." Totally makes sense. I can see by the fire. That's an easy place to look and an easy place to be. And as Canadians, what we see by the fire are the effects of our colonial system. And the effects that we see is the alcoholism, the drug abuse, and all that what as colonial system has done to our people. We are starting to see more culture and a little more language come back, but that's the easy thing that we can see by the fire. What's going to take courage and time is to look over here where the bone needle is, in the bushes. Because in these bushes, there's a 1,000-piece puzzle that is made up of all that's happened in order to get to where we are today, of what we see the effects of. And if I were to go over to this puzzle and just take one small piece of the puzzle out, that one small piece would be the residential school system. There is 999 other pieces to this puzzle over here that we still need to learn about and that we still need to educate about in order to be able to move forward in reconciliation. Some of those systems or some of those pieces are the 60 scoop, the PASS system. There is so much to learn over here. But all you're going to need in order to learn what's over there is a sense of decency and a sense of justice. Now, I would like to share with you some ways that you, as a Canadian, can start to move this reconciliation forward. Number one, I think it's really important for you in the place where you live, where your house is on, to know whose territory that is. Whose territory does your house reside on? What languages do they speak? Where is that community that's tied to that territory? And not only the place where you live, but also the place where you work. Whose territory is that? What's their languages? Where's the community? And what can you do living upon their territory to give back to them to start moving reconciliation forward? Find out about that. Number two, might be a little more tricky, is the governmental system that's in place today and the policies that are in place today that still hold back and suppress Indigenous people in moving forward. It's time for us to educate ourselves about things like land claims and treaty rights. What does it mean to you? What does it mean to them? And I think my biggest wonder, my biggest question that I have about our governmental system that's in place today, the largest system in our government that oversees all Indigenous people across Canada, that makes decisions for all Indigenous people across Canada, is led by two non-Indigenous white females. That makes me wonder. Is it because there's no Indigenous people within our Prime Minister's cabinet? I don't think so. So, just makes me wonder. It should make you wonder too. And be curious and ask those questions. Number 3, which I think is just as important as the first 2. But the Honorable Murray Sinclair always states to us that it is education that got us into this mess, and it will be education that gets us out of this mess. And it's time for us to get educated, to find out about all of the rest of the pieces that are here in the bushes by the bone needle. So, in order for us to move forward in reconciliation, we need to be able to move forward side by side, not someone in front, not someone behind, but together, side by side. In my culture, we talk about 7 generations ahead, and what we do today, here and now, will affect those generations ahead of us. So please, let's not leave them a legacy of pain and misery. Let's leave them with a hope for a better future, one that's rooted in honor and deep respect. Hayachka, thank you for the time today.